And how does that structure operate? Well, it's entirely top-down bureaucratic control, and the people at the bottom are supposed to take no initiative until they've checked it with Washington, because that's the way all bureaucrats operate, right? Nobody wants to put his rear end, as the expression goes, on the line without checking with higher authority, right? And of course, higher authority loves that because they want to be able to control. Right? So we have a system that's completely inverted from the constitutional system. And we saw how well that worked. Can you give me the place where we saw how well that worked not too long ago? New Orleans, right? And this was not an emergency that no one was aware of, no one was prepared for. They knew this was coming. They had known for years something like this was coming, and they did nothing to deal with it. The Army Corps of Engineers apparently had its finger in its ear. It wasn't doing nothing about it. Then they knew the hurricane was coming. They were warned about how bad it might be and how bad it became. And what was their response? Well, essentially chaos, and then beating up little old women to take their revolvers from them. Remember that? Have you seen that video on the internet? That fascinating one? With half a dozen burly thugs break into this woman's home and beat her up to steal this little revolver? This was their idea of homeland security. Right? Complete chaos and incompetence. And the assertion of authority. I mean, they love to do that. The more incompetent they are, the more they like to assert authority. That's what I've noticed. Because that assertion of authority makes up for the competence. If they're asserting authority, you can't be asking questions about their competence. That's why they do it that way. But it's exactly the opposite structure. Imagine in New Orleans, if they had had a militia structure 1/10 the size of what the Constitution would have required them. How many people in New Orleans? How many million people in New Orleans? I don't know. You pick whatever number you want. 2 million people in New Orleans. And in environs of New Orleans. Of the adults, let's say there were 80%, 60% of them were adults. Okay? 1.2 million adults. So under the constitutional militia structure, they would have had 1.2 million people organized for some number of years. Those people would have had food in their cellars. They all would have been armed, so you wouldn't have had looting or any of those other problems. They all would have been trained. They would have had particular contingents that were trained to deal with the levees because that was a problem in that city. Right? They would have brought all the engineering people that they had together into particular engineering companies to deal with that problem. And if the Army Corps of Engineers said, we're too lazy or incompetent to deal with it, then the New Orleans people would have dealt with it. All of those problems would have been solved years before the hurricane hit, if they had had 1.2 million organized. Well, let's take 10% of 1.2 million. What's that? That's right, 120,000. You think maybe 120,000 would have been enough in that set of circumstances, especially if they had been working 2 or 3, 4 years ahead of time? Of course it would have been. If we had had 1/10 of what the Constitution required in New Orleans, that catastrophe, that tragedy, that monumental stupidity would not have happened. Who's responsible for that? Well, if you look from the top down, because we always tend to think in terms of the top down, first it's Congress, right? Because Congress certainly didn't provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia in New Orleans. And then it's the Louisiana state government. They certainly didn't do it. And thirdly, it's whatever local government they have, city government, parish government, I guess is what they call them there instead of counties, right? Parishes. Those local governmental people certainly could have put pressure on the state government. If the state government hadn't done it, they might have done something on their own. They probably couldn't have called it militia because it wouldn't have been a state organization, but they could have set something up in the same structure. And then the bottom of the pyramid, the people who are supposed to be doing this, we the people, they're the ones who are responsible.